all about, you know, being able to give the actor that presence, like to how you shoot Julianne Moore, how you shoot Reese Witherspoon, or how you shoot these, you know, amazing actors. You know, they need a close-up. So this idea of just, you know, putting it into a master doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense.
He's an Academy Award nominee, a Genie Award winner, and a Cannes Film Festival Award winner. He's directed on stage as well as in film, and he's been given honors for his work around the world. In 2015, Atom Egoyan received the Governor General's Performing Arts Award. We met with him the morning after a screening of his 2002 film Ararat, commemorating the 1915 Armenian genocide.
Adam, I don't think I've ever started an interview this way, ever, actually, but I wanted to ask you about the origin of your first name. Because I know there's a story there.
Yeah, there is a story. It says in the Wikipedia that it's because of the advent of the first nuclear reactor in Egypt. My parents decided to call me Atom. But it was really to do with the idea that nuclear power was of the future. My father thought it'd be cool to have a son that was named for an energy source of the future. Okay. I was born in 1960. The story that's a little odd is that my sister, born 4 years later, was going to be called Molecule. And
which would have Frank Zappa, your father?
Exactly. Which would have translated into Molly. But then they thought, no, that's just too much. So they ended up calling her Eve. So it's Atom and Eve.
Oh, okay.
So, but what is odd about the name is that in classical Armenian, Adom, which is pronounced in the Eastern dialect with a T, comes off as being a very classical Armenian name, which is not what my parents intended.
Oh, really?
But when I go to Armenia, that is, I'm called Adom or Atom.
Okay.
So it ends up being a really great name.
Yeah, no kidding.
Multi-purpose name.
No kidding. Were your parents a big influence on you in where you ended up going in your life?
Yeah, my parents were a huge influence because they're both artists. They met at art college or in classes in Cairo. They both are very talented, both very driven, and we were really always surrounded by the arts, even though that's not what they ended up doing when they came to Canada. You know, they had to make a living, and so and they also made this curious decision to go to the west coast of Canada and went as far west as Victoria, BC, where we were one of the few, if not the only, Armenian family there. So they set up a private gallery, but that didn't really work. So it ended up being a furniture store. So I was always aware of my parents' artistic drive, and my sister as well. And so we were really influenced by that. But also just the practical sense of what it means to run a business. And because I started working at the furniture store from a very, very young age, I was delivering furniture with my dad. And I think they were a very strong influence. But it wasn't anything that they taught us explicitly. It was just what we absorbed. And I think that that's very often more impressive.
So did you, because of that, did you gravitate towards the arts almost from the beginning?
I would say I had a really amazing drama teacher at school. And in Victoria, there was a Victoria Drama Festival. And I got this sense very early on that, first of all, it was a great way to meet girls. You know, that basically if you wrote plays and you staged them and you were, you know, like it just was a really,
of course.
It was really amazing. So that became a really big part of my adolescence, and, you know, writing plays, putting them on these drama festivals, but also using drama as a way of expressing all sorts of issues that were really important to me. It was also at a time when, you have to remember, Monty Python just came onto the scene. So that idea of absurdist humor, coupled with like these writers who are called the theater of the absurd. These are writers like Eugene Ionesco, Samuel Beckett, Harold Pinter. You know, these were really strong influences for me. And so I just immersed myself in it. And I loved writing plays, writing, directing, and putting on these plays at school. To the point where I was actually writing plays for other schools. And it became a really big part of my life. When I graduated, I decided that I needed to do something practical. And I had this fantasy of becoming a diplomat. And I went to Trinity College in the University of Toronto with the idea of becoming a diplomat, where I would write these wonderful plays while I was solving world crises at the same time. You know, just, you know, very simple. You know, like,
hey, that's right. And this week I'll split the atom.
But my first play that I applied to at the U of T, I was turned down. And I was like so confused by this, because I'd never been turned down by a play, that I thought, okay, out of spite, I will make it as a film. So I went, to the Hart House Film Board, which had a film club, and I made that idea into a film. But that's really how I started making movies.
Wow!
It was as a way of getting back at being turned down for a play.
But a career built on bitterness. Well done.
Yes, which is not an un-Canadian way of actually advancing one's career. But it was an interesting thing, because the moment I held that camera, I thought, oh, this is so cool. This is like another character. This is like someone who is watching the drama, and that maybe I could actually use that as a hidden or unseen person. And I thought this was like a completely radical new way of thinking of cinema. Now, because I wasn't studying film, and because I wasn't a cinephile at that point, I was really working under a delusion. A lot of filmmakers have used this, but it's one of those things where you get excited about exploring new territory, and you give yourself this sense of almost like a vocation. And so I started making these short films at U of T, and by my second or third year, I knew this is what I wanted to do.
Yeah. And you were making these sort of on your own, outside of the classes you were taking.
Yeah,
and stuff.
I didn't study film, but there was this film club called the Hart House Film Board.
Okay.
And I was, making these shorts. And by the time I graduated, I had a number of these shorts. And then I didn't make my first feature, Next of Kin, until a couple of years after I graduated. And again, tiny budget, because I was working outside of the industry. I mean, obviously, but I had a couple of really amazing breaks, because my first feature was seen on television by an American film producer who happened to be in town shooting a series. And from that, I got the opportunity to work on these series like Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Twilight Zone, which were all shooting in Toronto at the time.
In what capacity were you?
As a director.
Okay.
I mean, it was kind of crazy, because I didn't have an agent. I didn't, but basically this person, you have to understand that at that time, independent filmmaking was not it wasn't as popular as it is now. It wasn't one of those things that everyone wanted to do. So it was possible, I think, and I was very lucky, but it was possible, to get these breaks and to start working at a pretty high level. Though that being said, I was learning on the fly.
Yeah.
I was teaching myself. For instance, I had to do a film for CBC called In This Corner, which involved a lot of boxing sequences. So I just studied like Raging Bull. I started all these great boxing films, and really teaching myself by study. By breaking it down, by storyboarding scenes, and by seeing what choices the director was making. And in a way, that was also around the time that VHS tape became available, so it was possible to take these classics and to watch them over and over again and to teach yourself.
It seems to me, though, that, that's like being thrown into the deep end of the pool.
Right.
You have to have a certain amount of moxie to be able to pull that off. And do you remember the very first time you were doing one of these things, and whether the guys around you, you're working with the crew, obviously.
Well, I'll tell you, like one of the first times was a complete nightmare. I got to do the pilot of Friday the 13th, the TV series, and I got to do it because I convinced the producers that I could shoot an hour-long pilot in 7 days, and most people were saying 10 days, and I just said I can do it. And on the first day, we were into overtime, and we still had to move the unit 2 times. Ahead, and I thought, okay, now I get fired, because I just really was so out of my depth. I had no idea how to manage a crew of that size. But it is this. I think sometimes you just throw yourself into a situation, and people see that you're trying your best. Hopefully you have some talent. What I felt from the very beginning, because of my high school experiences, that I knew how to work with actors. I always had this ability to understand what the actors needed on set. And a lot of the other things were things I picked up, in terms of how to manage a crew, how to understand the rhythm of how people are moving, being able to calculate what decisions would have to be made to make your day. All those things are things that came to me gradually. But I would say that those first films are, you can see, there was always a strong conceptual idea, but the film language was quite, I wouldn't say it was rudimentary. It was just, it had these very strong concepts that were very rigid, because I was coming from a theatrical background, and I had this very idea of what the camera needed to do. And I think what happens as you begin to understand the grammar is that some of the formulas make sense. I mean, you shouldn't just react against formula because it's a formula.
Yes.
Like even like the way this conversation is being covered right now.
Right.
At first I would say, okay, I'm not going to do master close-ups because that's a formula. I want to break that. And sometimes you realize that is the best way to photograph a face. It's to have 2 cameras or multiple cameras, and then to make those decisions later on in the editing. But you have to understand at the beginning, I didn't understand editing. I didn't understand, these basic concepts like axis, like where the cameras are, and all these grammatical things were ideas that I had to teach myself. And of course, you didn't want to walk onto a set and seem ignorant, so you would bluff. I mean, you would bluff that you knew what you were doing, and then learn it later on through your mistakes.
Right. So you were thinking of things in sort of theatrical terms, the way
Very
things are
much
staged.
so.
Yeah.
Yes, I still was thinking of the film as a proscenium, but as I say, I had this very strong idea that the actual instrument that was filming was a character. So in these early films, there was a missing character. Let's say my first film was called Next of Kin. And it's about this family that goes into therapy. They have a 23-year-old son who doesn't know what to do with his life. He's kind of catatonic. And they go into therapy. And this form of therapy involved videotaping sessions and having members of the family look at the videotapes later on and analyze their own behavior. One day he goes into the therapy to this clinic, Peter, and gets the tape of another family. And this other family are immigrants, Armenians, who gave up their child when they came to Canada because they couldn't afford to keep him, have had a daughter in the meantime who's reacted against the parents' very traditional values. And they're basically mourning the decision to have given up the son. So this guy watching this tape gets this crazy idea that he's going to pose as their son, returning after all these years. And so the camera, as we follow Peter go into this Armenian family, the camera becomes the spirit of the actual missing son watching him.
Okay.
Now, whether or not people get that, and they didn't really, but it allowed me to use this handheld technique. It allowed me to have this very observational style because I was actually observing it from the point of view of this missing character. And that to me was such a powerful concept that it really blasted through my lack of understanding of grammar. But it also allowed me to do a lot of these very complicated scenes in one take.
Right.
You realize later on that there are issues around that because you can't change rhythm, you can't sort of, you can't alter anything once you've committed to that.
Yes.
And it doesn't serve you that well when you're working with certain actors who really demand a close-up. Close-ups need a separate camera angle. They have to be lit. If you look at, let's say, a film like Chloe or one of my more I would say mainstream films. I mean, it's all about being able to give the actor that presence, like to how you shoot Julianne Moore, or how you shoot Reese Witherspoon, or how you shoot these amazing actors. They need a close-up. So this idea of just putting it into a master doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense.
Right. And when you say they need a close-up, that's your requirement, not necessarily theirs.
Oh,
or is
no,
it both?
It's never theirs. No. I mean,
No?
I've never been in a situation where I haven't had that control, but I just think sometimes it's very important. In order to study what someone is thinking, the camera is an amazing instrument. Sometimes the most cinematic thing you can do is to just have a close-up because it's magnified on screen, and you're able to really understand the complexity of what the person is trying to process.
Tell me about, you mentioned earlier that you had a natural ability to know what actors needed and how to deal with them, that you're very good at that. What does that entail exactly?
Just
what
listen.
sort of-
I mean, I think more than anything, it's listening. Like very often a director's job is to listen, is to understand what it is an actor needs. Now, very often it's also about management. You might have an actor who loves to rehearse over and over again, and then an actor who likes to do it on the first take. So how do you combine those two people in a scene? And how do you get them both to be the best they can be? So,
Yes.
so that requires a spatial sense of organization, but it's also just listening and talking, and you understand very early on too with some actors that they will download their whole life to you, that they will give you this breakdown of who they are. And at first, as a young director, you get confused because you think, oh, they want to be your friend, and they want to hear you tell your story back. They don't. They're just telling you, this is the material that I'm made of. You use of this as you wish. It's the clay you have, and that when I realized that some actors were doing that in these meetings that you would have, you begin to understand. Okay, so this is what it's about. This is I know all of this about you, and what you're giving me is what I can use in order to extract the best possible performance. And it's an interesting pact that you make. Yeah.
It's diplomacy. It's what you were originally going to.
It's interesting. You know, like last night we had this event here in Ottawa, and there were a lot of people from the Foreign Service, and they were watching the way my wife and I were sort of like presenting ourselves. And there is a lot of diplomacy in what I do. When you go to these film festivals, when you present the films, when you have conversations like this, you are very aware that there's an agenda that you're trying to present.
Sure.
Not that I'm saying there's an agenda here, other than
no, but I know exactly what you mean. I mean, this is, we are doing something that is, if these cameras weren't here, it might be like this, but it wouldn't be
exactly
like this.
No, it's very true. And so you know, there's a performative aspect, and we're both aware of that. And that fascinates me at some level. You know, it fascinates me that we're having this conversation, but there's like 4 cameras on us. You know, and so that does change the way that we're going to respond to each other. And I think a lot of the films that I've made deal with that. You know, how people actually interact with each other in a heavily mediated world. You know, and it's certainly, I started that when I was talking about the video therapy sessions in my first film, Next of Kin in 1984. In the past 30 years, I mean, that world has changed dramatically.
Yes.
And so the nature of what the media means, the fact that, you know, at that time, the world was divided into people who can make images, people who are watching images, and those two, there was almost a kind of a feudal system, I suppose, imposed as to how difficult it was to access image making, and certainly distribution. Well, that's, you know, anyone can not only make an image, but, you know, with a button, put it on YouTube or put it on this, you know, and it's like completely internationally distributed. It can go viral. That's radical.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about the writing then, because you started. That's how you started out, by writing your own stuff, and certainly in the early days of your career, you were filming your own stuff as well. How much does the fact that you would write dialogue for plays and for films and everything then inform what you're doing when you're filming, when you're adapting somebody else's work, like Russell Banks or something like that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I do think that there, of the adaptations I've done now, there's been 3. There's the Russell Banks, Sweet Hereafter, William Trevor's Felicia's Journey, and Rupert Holmes' Where the Truth Lies. They're very different writers. Some of the works come with dialogue, and you make the decision whether or not to keep the original writer's dialogue or to sculpted. Some of them are really just descriptive, and you have to create your own dialogue. But I think what you're informed by is a sensibility and a world that writer offers you that you wouldn't be able to create yourself.
Right.
I don't know what it means to be kind of a canteen manager in a Birmingham factory. Or I don't know what it means to be a young girl growing up in an Irish village. William Trevor provided that world. I don't know what it means to be in a small rural community, like the community that Russell Banks offers me in The Sweet Hereafter. But I understand what the issues are, and I'm very grateful for that cast of characters that are provided, but also for the moral universe that Russell Banks is presenting. You know, that just aligned with me, you know, very powerfully. It allowed me to deal with certain issues that I was wrestling with, you know, personally through his story, and that, I think, created an amazing collaboration. That's a film I'm very proud of. Where the Truth Lies was just a novel I couldn't put down. It was just like so much fun, and I think, like most kids growing up, I mean, the idea of the telethon as this marathon. I remember watching, you know, Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin, and just thinking that these guys were superhuman. But to have a story that's set, you know, during a telethon, this dark noir, you know, was just irresistible, and I just loved it, you know, in terms of the pleasure. But also Rupert Holmes was, you know, he wrote the Pina Colada song. He's a very popular entertainer. He's the only person, I think, to be winning a triple Tony for lyrics and book and music. You know, so he really knows the American entertainment machine. So when he writes a novel, you know, as fun and as pop as it is, it still has a certain validity. Like, I think that's what you look for when you're doing an adaptation. It's this idea of a world that you couldn't dream of yourself. The original scripts are really coming from a personal place, and I've been really privileged to be able to have made these films. But they're all based on aspects of, you know, either people I know directly or of situations that are coming from my own life.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the criticisms that you've had in the last little while and how they've affected you. And I wanted to preface this. I was thinking about this as I was reading some of those criticisms of The Captive, your last film, which I frankly quite like, but I don't know what their problem with it was. But I have a book called The Apologist. It came out many years ago, written by Jay Rayner. He was the restaurant critic at The Observer. And he wrote this fictional piece about a restaurant critic whose reviews were so scathing that at one point a chef kills himself by sticking his head in the oven. And the review was the food tasted better coming up than it did going down, which I thought was a brilliant review. but I thought of that when I read this one criticism of The Captive, where somebody said, "This looks like a film made by a young filmmaker who's watched too many Atom Egoyan films." And I thought, what the hell?
Yeah.
What is that supposed to mean? Now I know that you were affected at Cannes by the reaction on one occasion to the showing of that film and the stuff that came out afterwards, but. As somebody who has to have the surety and confidence that you have to be able to do this to begin with, and all the things that you've just talked about, does that shake your foundation sometimes when that happens?
To be honest, that particular experience did, because I was suffering from a major case of hubris going into Cannes last year. I had created a mythology in my own mind of what it meant to go with The Captive, because it had been 30 years since I made my first feature film that I'd first taken to an international festival, Next of Kin, in Germany. It had been 25 years since I first presented a film in Cannes at the Directors Fortnight. It had been 20 years since Exotica was in competition. That was my breakthrough film. And I thought, all these stars are lining up. And I'm proud to bits of Captive. I think it's a really strong piece of work. It's been my most popular film in Canada. Like, the release was extraordinary. So the public response has been really good, without one positive review. Like, it's been quite remarkable that way. No one has really championed the film. And I think it's an incredibly important film in terms of what the subject matter is talking about. But I also just think it's kind of very gripping. Like, there are people who just respond to it viscerally. But it's true that when you have an expectation, like what happened that morning in Cannes at the press screening, was something that I'll never forget, because I wasn't there.
You weren't there for it, right?
And so I just got the feedback, and it just really began. It was a crazy day. A crazy day.
It was like people saying to you, "Don't go on social media," right?
Right.
Yeah.
Don't look at your Twitter account. I don't even have a Twitter account. And then seeing, like, there was a whole series of things that's supposed to happen that day, starting with a press conference, starting with a series of like one-on-one interviews you're supposed to have, and I could just see that whatever I thought was going to happen had sort of actually come back to haunt me in this really, really crazy way, to the point where I warned the actors for the premiere that night that they should expect a hostile reaction. And we all went up that red carpet thinking this was going to be like a nightmare. It ended up being an incredible screening. Like no one walked out. There were no boos. We had a 10-minute standing ovation. But that didn't really alter the fact that that morning, the press had a very hostile response.
That sort of thing, I mean, your first visceral response, would it have been just, "I'm going to the airport and getting on a plane and going home"? That would have been mine.
That's a really interesting point. I just don't think that what could have happened. I'm also, you have to remember, with the film like Captive, I'm also the producer. I'm also responsible for, at some level, all these actors that are there, all the people who've invested in the film, all the distributors that have supported the film. I mean, I can't just abandon them. If I was an actor, I mean, I suppose that's something that might be possible. There's this very famous story of Jean-Luc Godard coming to the New York Film Festival, and the New York Times Review kind of completely demolished his movie, and he did just that. He got on a plane and went back to Paris. But I just don't know if I would be able to do that with a film that I'm so invested in. I mean, it might be possible with a film that I'm directing, but... Well, I'm also really proud of the movie.
Yes.
I mean, it was interesting last night showing Ararat here in Ottawa, like almost 15 years after that, because that film met with a lot of resistance as well. And sometimes it just takes time. Sometimes, sometimes the place and way in which a film is launched is not the best way to introduce it to the world, and it'll find its own audience. And I look at what's happening with Captive now in terms of its release, and its like number 2 or 3 on iTunes right now as we speak, and people really do connect to the movie. Some people very strongly, some people less so, some people not at all. But I think it is offering. It's one of those movies where the plot is something you know. I mean, beforehand, it's like it's a formula in a way. You know, a father searching for a missing daughter. I mean, it's the stuff of many films. There have been abduction movies since M.
But what happens within that trope is completely different.
Very different.
Yes.
And maybe people, like the critics, were just too obsessed with the trope itself, and that I'm trying to make a genre movie, which is unusual for me. I don't usually write genre films. And this was my attempt to do that, to kind of marry my personal vision with a genre, and maybe the critics just didn't want that to happen.
So when you say that you went into Cannes with a certain amount of hubris, and I guess this brought you down a notch or two, but in a way, it was a valuable experience for you, was it not?
Yeah, it's all. Listen, it's all. You're still privileged to be there. I mean, it's still incredible that your film is shown at that level, and that there is a discussion around it, even if it's hostile. I mean, there are so many filmmakers who are just trying to get their product seen, and so I consider myself to be incredibly privileged, and this is part of the cost. I mean, some days are going to be as crappy as that day was in Cannes. It was a crappy day. I mean, something very surreal happened to me that morning, which was like I'll never forget. I was going right after the press conference. There was a series of interviews on a rooftop in a hotel in Cannes, very beautiful place, and at one point, I just felt really ill. Like I felt my stomach churning, and I excused myself, and I went to the washroom, and I'd been given this jacket by a very famous designer, and I thought, I don't know if I'll wear this jacket because it's a little too decorative for me, but I'll do it anyway, just because it's my premiere in Cannes. I'll wear this jacket. And I went into the washroom, and I was looking at myself in the mirror, just splashing water on my face, just telling myself to calm down. Everything was going to be okay, and like don't let your imagination run away with you. Don't and really just banish the thought that you're smelling smoke right now, or that you look over and your jacket seems to be on fire. And that's what I saw. I saw flames emerging from my sleeve, and I thought, this is incredible. I'm actually in the middle of a living nightmare because this can't be happening. And then I thought, this is kind of crazy. And then suddenly I felt heat on my arm, and I went, oh, my jacket actually is on fire. And I took it off, and it was a surreal sight seeing this. And then I realized, because it was kind of a boutique washroom hotel, that they had little candles beside the sinks. And while I was splashing water on my face, I had set my jacket on fire. And this set off the alarm system. These big, beefy French security guys came in. They were like wondering what had happened. And I was stomping on this jacket, trying to put it out. And then I just thought, okay, this is going to be a surreal day. And I just walked out, and the publicist said to me, what happened to your jacket? I said, don't ask. And I just sort of went on with the day. So yes, you will have days like that.
Yes.
But the good thing is you get to talk about days like that, and you put it behind you. But it does teach you something. It teaches you, yes, the Buddhists are right. The key to happiness is to have a world without expectation. But how can that happen? I mean, if you don't have expectation, if you don't have a fantasy, I just don't know how you actually create drive, and I don't know how you get excited about things. But certain things will come back to haunt you. Some things you'll be punished for. And what made it completely surreal is I still get conflicting reports from journalists who were there at the screening in the morning. They say it wasn't roundly booed. There are a lot of people who were applauding, some people, but in my imagination, it was 3,000 people in a room at the premiere of my film, standing up and booing me. And that, I'm glad I wasn't there, but it's an indelible image. There's no question, I'm sure.
We've run short of time, Adam. This has been great. I really appreciate it. We did it. Thanks a lot.
Ending on that.
There we go. Yes, a learning experience.